the SPA video series, and today we're talking with Stephen Crisp, CEO of Sheep Producers Australia, and he's also in charge of running the marketing, market access and trade policy portfolio. And that's what we're going to delve into today. So Stephen, what is the overview of that portfolio?
Well, all commodity groups will consider marketing, market access and trade in one way or another. And it will depend on the individual industry, how they split their responsibilities for these areas between the RDC, in our case, the Research and Development Corporation, government, and of course, industry itself, the private sector, the processors, producers, and what they do. Whilst a lot of it relates to the product integrity system, it mainly deals with how product should and could be marketed domestically and overseas, what access the product has in different trade regions or countries, how that can be improved, how we deal with threats to that trade access or our trade competitive position, in other words, our terms of trade. Considering all the other factors that may enhance or impair the delivery of sheep meat to market is just a massive job and an undertaking which involves so many different facets of both government and the private sector that it takes a lot to encompass. It may seem a straightforward operation. However, there's politics, logistics, and the simple competitive nature of the world trade that makes it one of the most rewarding areas, but at times also one of the most frustrating areas to work within and how you navigate that. So if you're interested in, if anyone's interested in how the sheep meat industry navigates the marketing, market access, trade area, then I would recommend they look through the series of videos which we're about to put together.
So looking today at the market access and trade portfolio within Sheep Producers Australia. So Stephen, what are the separate sections that the MMAC committee look at?
Well, first of all, you've got to define marketing in terms of sheep meat and what that entails. So you've got domestic marketing campaign, and everyone's quite familiar with the Australia Day campaign that has been a very much a rewarding spot for the sheep meat industry and obviously the lamb brand. But there's also our True Aussie brand, which is represented overseas. This is particularly prominent at trade shows, which we also utilise, not just meat shows, but obviously food trade fairs, which are quite large worldwide. And of course, the other thing which we shouldn't forget is the main marketing of our product is actually the processors and exporters themselves who have their own branded product. Market access is separate from that again. This relates to our free trade agreements. In particular, we've got a couple of free trade agreements which are being negotiated at the moment in the EU and the UK, but we have many free trade agreements set up with the US, South Korea, China, and many other countries. And so that market access relates to how well we've negotiated those agreements in the past. There are also what are called non-tariff barriers, and these can basically be anything. These can be the way that the documentation is set up, the expiry dates that are set upon our product, or any of the customs procedures which can make it easier or more difficult to access a country with our product. There's also the dispute management system through the World Trade Organization, which is a fairly onerous and slow process, and is really pretty much a last resort if you wanted to go down that road, and if you want to use that as a vehicle for improving or solving a dispute with market access. Then you've just got the trade in general. Trade is a pretty much a catch-all term that encompasses how our whole export supply chain works. It goes right through the regulatory, the transport sector, but even the financial services and how that operates in being able to export your product and also, most importantly, get paid for it. So there's all these different sections which we define in sheep meat as MMAT, marketing, market access and trade, but it encompasses a whole range of areas and even ones which through the government departments we don't immediately think of, but we have a lot of relationships within government and within the export sector themselves that we have to interact with to know all the issues that are happening at any one time.
So when you're working within that marketing, market access and trade portfolio, there's a number of organisations involved and there are a lot of moving parts in the sheep meat export industry. So who's involved as well as Sheep Producers Australia?
Well, obviously the role of MLA is a very large one in this space, because they use producer levy funds to promote sheep meat. So we have in sheep meat, we have the transaction levy, which is 2%, but it is capped at $1.50 for lamb and 20 cents for sheep when they're sold through either the sale yards or sold to a processor, or even sold between properties. So that's the levy funds that they are utilising. MLA will use those funds in marketing with having people in country. They'll use it for campaigns, as I said before, with trade shows and the True Aussie brand, which is the brand we use. They may do this in conjunction with Austrade, especially if you're doing cross-sectoral promotions. Obviously, that could be at a food fair or any other cross-sectoral promotion, which is just promoting Australian food. Obviously, we would want red meat, and in particular sheep meat included in that where possible. And along with the exporters themselves, who have played a huge role in product promotion and opening trades, they would want assistance from the levy funds where it's appropriate, where we want to open up a market and they need assistance. Obviously, that's a benefit to sheep producers everywhere, because it opens up new markets, more competition for our product, and a better farm gate price. And it's also part of trade representations in general. It's always good to have the exporters there, because they're the ones who are actually producing the product in a box, or even the live export trade. So you want them to play a major role in those markets developed. Obviously, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade plays a major role in this space. They're the ones that negotiate our free trade agreements. So that's where the negotiators actually sit. The Department of Agriculture and Water and Environment, or DOR, depending on who you talk to and how you say that, they play a greater role in maintaining market access and ensuring producers and exporters comply with our trade requirements, and even in administering the quota where we have markets which have a defined quota. That quota has to be split amongst exporters, and that's not a simple process, at least not as simple as many people may think, and that all has to be recorded and allocated accordingly for the following year, and that's quite a process. So that's where the Department of Agriculture gets into that role. The exporters also have their own compliance work, which they have to do. They have quality assurance staff, in addition to all the export documentation and shipping sections, all the stuff they have to comply with in that. To gain a health certificate is a big deal. That's pretty much your right to sell that product overseas, and that's what forms the major document of the agreement between different countries, is that we have to be able to produce that health certificate and everything that represents, which is pretty much, the clean green product and all the quality assurance systems that sit behind that. They all lead up to gaining that health certificate and the other documentation that sits around it. And we also have to ensure that the importing countries' requirements are met. And those importing requirements can be very different from country to country. Some of them place a much greater emphasis on the expiry dates. Others have very strict requirements on particular residue limitations, and they require different types of testing for the product to go there. And it could literally be anything. And it's all part of that negotiating those trade agreements as to how we can arrive at something that we can actually physically deal with. Many organisations also deal with a whole chain of trade. So we have to deal with transport, both domestic and international, along with the customs officials in both Australia and also in the importing country. And the list of what trade involves, all the way from producers to the financial institutions that facilitate those transactions, that's actually quite a long chain of events. If you're selling into some markets where oftentimes a letter of credit may be used, you've got to have a banking system which pretty much you lodge your export documentation with a bank. You don't even give it to the person that you're selling the product to. The bank then pays you the money, and then it's a bank-to-bank transfer at the other end. So trade's not a simple proposition all the time. There's a lot of different stages of development in different markets, and you've really got to work out which area you want to trade into and what your capabilities are and where you want to trade. And it's the role of our organisation and government to try and make that as simple as possible.
So being such a complex area, and as you say, it starts at the farm level and flows all the way through the supply chain, Where can producers find out more information about what they should be doing to meet those requirements that you've talked about that are required further down the supply chain?
Yeah, that's a good question. So producers themselves, it all flows back from the exporter. The exporter deals with a site called MICOR, MICOR. It's basically a site which gives all the in-country requirements, and it's issued by the Department of Agriculture, and only exporters can go into that site. But from that, they must tell producers exactly what they need for every market. So if they've got a particular brand going in a particular market, then they will actually have to ask for those particular requirements. From there are also MLA will also issue advice on what's required for different markets, and in that you will get the export slaughter intervals for different chemicals, the withholding periods for what producers are allowed to utilise a chemical on property, and how long it is before they would be allowed to sell those animals for slaughter. And that's obviously a very important requirement. Obviously, lamb we've changed the definition of lamb and the dentition requirements of that. We don't have the complications of beef with the age limitations in many markets, because it usually is just lamb or sheep meat. But when we get our quality assurance systems in place and our carcass feedback systems become better and better, you will find that brand development comes and those feedback loops become even more important from the processor back to the producer. The other thing is around the health requirements. Some of the countries' requirements are disease-free. For instance, Saudi Arabia has new requirements around what has to be put in place for the scaly mouth vaccine before they can be put on the vessel. So obviously producers would need to know those requirements for them to be sold into that market. And we also have the National Sheep Health Monitoring Program, which has a livestock data link back to producers. So producers should be more and more aware of what diseases are on their property, how they can be managed, and whether they have any difficulties in supplying any of the different markets. We're very fortunate in Australia. Most of the time it doesn't even come into consideration, but it is up to the purchasers, the exporters, the processors to inform their producers of exactly what they need if they want to get a premium for a particular market.
So we're talking marketing, market access and trade with Stephen Christ from Sheep Producers Australia. And Sheep Producers is the peak industry body. So how is a peak industry body involved in these interactions, Stephen?
Yeah, the role of the peak industry bodies are, I suppose, quite varied. Now, I suppose the technical answer is that Sheep Producers Australia, as the peak producer body, is actually involved under an Act of Parliament, the Australian Meat Industry Act, or the AMLI Act. It has the prescribed body to inform policy and strategy on how levy payers' funds are spent. This is a direct function in terms of a service provider like MLA or even AHA, but MLA has a marketing budget for both domestic and international use. So the strategy on how that is spent and where that is spent, obviously we take a massive amount of technical advice from MLA and the market focus, but the strategy of which markets are growing and matching that to the supply of the product, that's where the peak bodies get involved in reviewing that and making sure that our levy funds are spent in the most cost-effective manner. Usually it's only a slight shift in focus and where we put our in-country resources, which can be absolutely vital in opening a market or retaining a market. Obviously, we've been in a very low supply situation at the moment, so we have been shifting our resources away from a growth market. There's no point in promoting a new market and trying to grow a market when you haven't got the product. So this is a great time to focus on those non-tariff barriers. And that's this kind of focus shift and policy strategic direction. That's where a peak body such as Sheep Producers Australia comes in our discussions with our service provider. The peak body also engages with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to ensure that sheep meat is a priority in any of the trade negotiations where market access has been lacking. There's a classic case happening right now with the EU. Australia's had very low allocation into the EU, embarrassingly so. At the moment with the Brexit, it's down to a few thousand tonnes per year for the whole of the Australian production system. That's all we're allowed to put into the EU. So obviously with the current negotiations, we are front and centre with DFAT, talking to the negotiators, saying, advising that obviously we would like liberalisation, but also pushing the position for sheep meat in saying that we must have a better access deal, and advising what that might be. This is especially important if we're having a free trade negotiation in an area or country or region that has a significant number of consumers of sheep meat. So obviously we would love access to India, which is a very difficult market to crack, but there are a lot of sheep meat eaters in that market. So it's, I suppose, one of the holy grails of market access, and we would like to see what Australia can do on a bilateral basis or as part of a multilateral agreement. And we're in constant talks about DFAT about how we can engage better with certain markets. They're just examples. Obviously, there's multiple markets that we look at every year. SBA would also be involved if there are additional non-tariff barriers placed on sheep meat. This directly affects exporters, but it also affects the farm gate price and what exporters can afford to pay us. In the case of the Middle East, this is a particularly good example. In the case of sheep meat, expiry dates have just been lengthened on our product for access into that market, which means we have increased ability to put chilled sheep meat into that market, especially via sea freight. You now have time to get the product there by sea freight and have time to market the product before the product technically expires. It's a lot cheaper to put it in there by sea freight as opposed to air freight, and also just gives you a lot more flexibility. If something goes wrong in the shipping process, then all of a sudden you don't lose an incredible amount of the value of that product if you then have to sell it very quickly at a discounted price. There's so much that happens in that trade space. So these are the sort of non-tariff barriers where we would get involved and encourage government to negotiate a better outcome for Australian exporters, because it all relates back to what those exporters can afford to pay at the farm gate. And trade also encompasses anything that affects the ability of sheep producers to have their product consumed domestically or overseas. So, like I said before, this can relate to transport and shipping, but it also can relate to customs. You don't want customs having to spend a long time inspecting product or holding product on the port. It has a greater chance of something going wrong in the port, especially where you've got refrigerated containers that must be plugged in, or in the case of air freight, simply sitting on the tarmac, because they're not actually in refrigerated containers. They rely on the dry ice. So it's vitally important that we have those customs relations, which a lot of it can be political. And so we need to have a very good political relationship as well as government to government and technical relationships. And that's where SBA plays a major role.
About marketing, market access and trade, and it's a huge portfolio that you work in, Stephen, but what does this really mean for producers on the ground every day on farm?
Yeah, and I suppose that's always been an issue where producers do not see or feel a direct link to the marketing of their product. Yet a lot of what they do directly affects our ability to trade and our market access for sheep meat. So the things that they must do, obviously, pay strict attention to the export slaughter intervals and withholding periods of the chemicals they use. I suppose that's square one, making sure that we don't put any of our markets at risk because of our on-farm practices. But they also should fully engage with the production assurance process which is the MLA accreditation process for their property identification code. It's really important that is seen as a valuable part of the process. This is what we've committed with trading partners to do, to make sure that we have welfare standards, biosecurity standards that meet the expectations of our trading partners. We do place some extra requirements on producers now, but the reasoning behind that is to increase that market access. Obviously, the more markets you have access to, then the more options you have to send a greater number of products. One carcass could go to 30 different countries. We have access to almost 90 countries. So you've got to appreciate that the best way of maximising the value of that carcass is to have the most number of different parts going to different sections of the world who are willing to pay the most for whatever small part of that carcass they require. So just by doing that MLA accreditation process and putting in place what is required under the LPA system, that's one of the best things that they can do. The other thing that they can do is utilise industry feedback. There's not only the National Sheep Health Monitoring Program, which gives them obviously very good feedback on disease and how they can be more productive, but also the carcass feedback systems are improving all the time from processors. This is obviously going to increase a lot with the more and more amount of direct marketing producers do with processors. And with, if you've got electronic tracing, then they can actually give individual carcass feedback. That feedback's vital. If they want to hit specifications for a specific market, which is paying more for your product, then that not only allows those brand owners to better promote their product and have a more consistent supply, but it also allows that producer to gain a premium. Obviously, if there's no premium, there's no point in doing it. So I wouldn't be saying that anyone gets involved in a system where there's no benefit to them just because the system's there doesn't mean you have to use it. But if people are willing to pay that premium, that's for a reason. If you're producing for a specific brand, and then all parts of that supply chain will benefit because someone's willing to pay more at the end of the line. So that's probably the main reasons why producers should take serious note of how the product is marketed and where they tap into that.
Businesses are always looking for great people to work in industry. So if someone had a real interest in any of these areas around trade and marketing, what would you suggest? How would they find out more? Where would they go? Where would they look if someone wanted to work towards a job opportunity in this area?
It's a tough area because there really is no set formula for where young leaders can get involved in the area, especially in marketing and trade. Whilst we do have our larger organisations and there's graduate programs and other methods, a lot of people may start even in the public service in the area of trade and compliance and gain exposure to industry that way and solving issues, writing or reforming regulation. That's a pathway which often leads into the peak bodies because they get to know and love a particular commodity and can see where they can assist in the development of that commodity and the value chain. Others work with service providers and gain experience in marketing the product in different regions or work in developing the product for varied markets. That's a fantastic pathway if you can get exposure to the different markets and the different way that the product is presented, the different cultural, not just festivals, but the way the product is utilised. That's fantastic feedback on which can be go through the export chain and right back to producers in the type of animal that suits those markets, which are often growing markets. Then there is always working within industry, especially at a processor or export section of the supply chain, in getting to know the product and complying with all the different market requirements. And the best thing you can do is sit down, if available, with an exporter and look at how they actually calculate the value of that carcass, which will obviously massive amounts of space probably get simplified over time since I was involved in this area. But you look at all the different markets and the different splits on where all the different types of product will go, where the best market for that product is, what's the total value, which includes even the rendering product, which includes the skins, includes the tallow, and the whole meat and bone meal, everything that comes out of a plant, and that equation and how that spits out the bottom line on what the value of that carcass is. That sort of experience and bringing that back to producer level and getting a whole of supply chain attitude for a producer, and that is where the leadership in our industry is most required. You will not get producers, exporters, anyone supporting everything that is required from industry to increase value if they can't see the whole picture. So the best thing for young leaders to do is to start anywhere in the system, anywhere where they see a career opportunity, but then getting involved with all the programs and information that comes from the whole supply chain, especially from our larger RDC operations, Animal Health Australia, great service provider, MLA, our largest service provider, looking at the National Residue Service and getting the whole picture put together. The more programs that we can supply on the technical aspects and governance aspects of industry, that's great. But it's getting that full picture that's the most important, and young leaders can tap into any of those sections And I've seen everyone succeed from any background, as long as they've got a passion for it and they want to learn.
Stephen, thanks so much for telling us about the marketing, market access and trade portfolio today. It's been fascinating to find out more about what you do with Sheep Producers Australia. And if you'd like to find out more about any of our other webinars in our information series, please go to sheepproducers.com.au/leadership. See you next time.